Good evening. Welcome, everybody, to this great occasion. I'm Emily Rafferty. I am a vice chair of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum Board, and I've been on the board since 2004. And I certainly have known Alice Greenwald very well during her years with us. And I want to extend a welcome to those of you who are museum members here tonight. And thank you for being with us in person, and also thank all of you out there who are on our webcast. This program marks the inaugural Alice M. Greenwald public program. Alice served as the Memorial Museum's first director, taking the role in 2006. In the position, she oversaw the development and implementation of a founding vision for this institution and managed our exhibitions, collections, and educational initiatives. In 2017, she added to her already prestigious responsibilities. She became president and CEO, where she not only maintained her role as museum director, but successfully led the memorial and museum through the difficult days of the pandemic. Alice had a hand in literally everything and cared deeply, and everything you see is in her extraordinary experience in doing this. I've had the great pleasure, as I said, of working with Alice during all of these times, and I can attest to the exceptional job she has done here. With sensitivity and courage and great aptitude, she has brought this institution to the days when our new friend Beth Hillman, took her role about 18 months ago. When Alice retired in 2022, members of the board wanted to create a lasting tribute for Alice in recognition of her long-time service, leadership, and dedication to the institution. And what better way than a named public program in her honor, a program that, like all of our public programs, tackles complex, relevant issues by increasing numbers every day, we know, and current events with unparalleled depth and consideration. You could describe Alice in the same way. In addition to the name program, which will run every fall, we have also dedicated a seat, Alice, your seat, in your home. Thank you for your 16 years. We look forward to seeing you in the future years as often as you like to come, and certainly for all of our major events where we recognize the families and their losses. As Israel, now turning to the program, that was quite a transition I didn't make, but I'm making it now. As Israel continues its war in Gaza in response to Hamas's October 7 attack, the challenges of conducting a military operation in one of the most densely populated areas in the world have become clear. To help us understand the conflict and where it may be headed, we're joined by retired Colonel Liam Collins. Colonel Collins is a former Special Forces officer, former director of the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, and co-author of Understanding Urban Warfare. He is also the executive director of the Viola Foundation and the Madison Policy Forum, a senior fellow with New America, and a permanent member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us, Colonel Collins. We know your schedule is very full, especially in these days of this timely topic. So it's an honor to have you with us, as it always is, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Emily. And just a note of my own thanks to Alice for what she contributed here and essentially, as Emily said, made this place what it is today. And this is a lovely way to recognize that, because it is a matter of great urgency that we see in the news every day. And one of the things we try to do with the programs here is just give our audience just a perspective on events that takes a little bit of a step back and tries to turn to people who have been engaged in one way or another with the issues at hand to take a step into their expertise, to try to get them to explain to us how they see a particular problem at a point in time and what they would envision as a solution or a way to understand better the problems that are enormously overwhelming to an audience like us that are not necessarily expert in this, but that are seeing things that are just extremely difficult, not just to understand, but to see. And I can think of no one better to do this than Liam Collins. You heard from Emily his extraordinary credentials, his service as a special forces operator in the US military, but also his scholarly work at the Combating Terrorism Center and teaching at West Point and trying to teach the next generation of military leaders what some of those challenges are and how to think about them. Liam also was one of the earliest supporters of the museum. Before we were opened even, he and his colleagues were briefing us, they were coming here, and frankly, it was in part our association with them that gave us some of the earliest credibility that we had as an institution, and we've tried to build on that over the years, but we know very well what the base of all of that remains to this day. So Liam, welcome, and thank you very much for doing this.
Thanks for having me back.
You know, I want to start because we will obviously talk about what's going on in Gaza, but there is a background to this. I mean, your book, Understanding Urban Warfare, takes apart the challenges of operating in a city that becomes a military space, a combat space, but also it recounts case studies of how the military learned or didn't learn lessons in really dire circumstances in many cases. And while you have some earlier examples, a World War II example, the one I want to start with is Mogadishu in October of 1993, the famous Black Hawk Down incident, which is something that it appears from the way the story is told in the book, that no one was really planning for anything like this. And the kind of approach that would later inform urban warfare strategy for the US Army, that kind of didn't exist. And so the losses there were significant. The lessons learned had to be significant because of the nature of those losses. But what could you do to summarize for us what that circumstance was and what some of those lessons learned were that carried forward in the years ahead? Because we will see some of those lessons, even talking about the war in Iraq and now, more recently, what's going on in Gaza.
Yeah, so in Mogadishu, I mean, the troops that were down there as part of that operation, I mean, they were looking for the warlords, right? They were really doing raids, looking for them, trying to capture them to try to make some stability in there as part of really a humanitarian operation under a UN operation. So it was really part of a peacekeeping operation that they were there for. And then ultimately, right, they had done a many successful raids in the past. That was the 7th one where they had gone in. Sometimes they had captured the people they were after. Sometimes they couldn't. Some were kind of the lower lieutenants. But on that time, right, they ended up being, not surprisingly, stuck in the city for nearly 24 hours for a lot longer than they expected. And so I think that's the one of the things to learn is from that is, I think anybody that's been in the military kind of hears they didn't have their night vision goggles, but they get overly criticized for that. It was 1993. They might not have been at the standard that they are now, but either way, they didn't plan on being there for that long, and so they didn't carry equipment that you would think now. One of the lessons we took out of that is anytime you leave to go and do an operation, you may not come back for an extended period of time, and so you're carrying what you can. One of the other big lessons we learned from that is they actually asked to bring, tanks or armored vehicles over there for protection. And so when it came time to go and kind of recover this force, there was no U.S. forces over there that had that because it was a political decision not to send them over there. So I think on a political level, one of the things you learn from Mogadishu is if you're not willing to send armored vehicles for a deployed force, because politically you don't think it's a good thing to do, then maybe you shouldn't go there because that is absolutely something you have to have in a city. And so it took them many more hours to recover that force than it otherwise would have, and they had to actually go to the Pakistanis who had armored vehicles over there to help with the recovery. And so I think that's one of the big lessons that came out of that was, you have to go over there with the right equipment, and if you're not willing to do that, then we probably don't need to be there in the first place.
Let me turn to one of the interviews in the book is with now Lieutenant General James Rainey, who had an important role in the Second Battle of Fallujah in the war in Iraq, because he describes the relationship of the forces that have to be sent in. And so it goes to this point of there needs to be backup, there needs to be protection, but the protection is multi-layered. So I'll quote from him. He says, if you have to fight in an urban area, you want everything. You want tanks that can penetrate. If you want tanks, then you have to have infantry to protect them. If you want to have infantry to protect them, then you have to have infantry fighting vehicles to position your rifle squads on the ground. So on and on and on, it becomes a really significant operation, almost by definition. This is not really a matter of just going in, not breaking down a door and getting somebody out in an urban area. You are, I assume, figuring that you are going to be surrounded by hostile forces in an unwelcoming environment.
Yeah, and so what you need is what we call combined arms, right? You need the infantry, right? Because they go and, but they're vulnerable, so you need the tanks to protect them. But in an urban environment, right, the streets, you can't elevate the turret of the tank necessarily. So if somebody's on the 5th or 6th floor, the tank can't do anything about it. So you need the infantry to go clear those floors around the tanks. You need engineers to breach obstacles, right? There's going to be booby traps, obstacles throughout that the enemy places. So they need to clear those obstacles. You need artillery, right, to put fires in. And I think people often think when you're thinking of urban combat, you think of the movies or something, and you're going in there and they're conducting like room clearing operations, right? Absolutely, that's a last resort. Unless you're doing hostage recovery, the last thing you want to do is send somebody through that door over there with an enemy potentially waiting on the other side or booby trapped. Right, and what we've learned through warfare historically, that's why you want to put a round in there first, right? You want to put a tank round in there, an artillery round, and those things are highly destructive, and that's why you'll typically have urban warfare, right? If there's heavy fighting in there, you can expect 80 to 95% of the buildings will be damaged or destroyed because you're trying to protect the force. So again, the last thing you want to do is send a squad through that door not knowing what's on the other side. You want to eliminate that threat first. And so that's why it's so highly destructive. But combined arms is something that's, proven, well, since we've had them, right? So really kind of going back to World War II once, tanks came about. But you want to have the tanks, the armor, the infantry, the artillery, and you absolutely need to have them working together in that environment, and then they can be effective.
So, you think about what combined arms means. But also, they're operating in an urban environment. You described one example of a problem that they face. But talk about, more generally, the difficulties of urban combat.
Yeah, so urban environment is, without a doubt, the most challenging environment that you can fight in. More challenging than the desert, jungle, Arctic, any other environment. And there's a number of reasons for it. One is the terrain, right? The three-dimensional nature of the terrain. You have the surface that you have everywhere, but then you have the super surface, right? These buildings can go up, dozens, many stories up into the sky. You got the subsurface, right? Tunnels, whatever it is underneath, right? But collectively, what those allow the enemy to do, right? It could be an unsophisticated enemy or a sophisticated enemy, but those neutralize the advantages of kind of advanced militaries, right? Our intelligence and collection platforms that are up in the air can't penetrate that, right? So an enemy can hide either using the tunnels or within a building. They don't have to spend a lot of time, hours or days building up a defense because they can just stand in this concrete structure and you could just stand right in the back of the room so no one can see you. You could be shooting out that window as a sniper and no one knows where that fire is coming from, or they make little mouse holes, as they call it, that you almost can't see unless you're looking with binoculars, and they're shooting out those. And so it allows an unsophisticated enemy these kind of advantages. Tunnels, right? The GPS, right? Your navigation, radios don't work, right? Your phones don't work. These challenges that the environment proposed. And then really one of the other really big ones is civilians, right? Historically, as we see in Gaza right now, as we saw in Fallujah, you saw not maybe a little bit in Marawi in the Philippines, but no matter how much, if you try to evacuate the civilians because you want them out of there, right? You're trying to minimize, right, civilian casualties. Any military is trying to do that. But typically, you're looking at 10% that aren't going to leave, right? So in a city like Gaza City, for example, of 650,000, even if you get 95 or 90% of the civilians evacuated, you still have 65,000 civilians you have to contend with when you're doing operations there. and then that draws, right, the fighting in the urban environment. Nobody really cares if you're dropping bombs and destroying trees or sand out in the desert, right? But it's visual. You can see the damage that's being done in an urban environment. That often puts political pressure on the attacker because of that destruction or because of civilian deaths, which can be compounded by the fact that the enemy may be using the civilians as a shield.
So you've brought us up to Gaza, but I did want to get a sense of the combined arms in relation to air fires as well, because what you mentioned before is just what's going on the ground and the need for sort of the reinforcement, multiple layers of reinforcement of troops. But there's also the question of, if you're protecting the force, it would appear from many of the case studies, aircraft platforms firing into these urban areas is in many ways what they talk about preparing the battlefield, but it is in many ways the best way to protect the force.
Right, and some of the advantage like an aircraft will have dropping a bomb from the sky, again, thinking of the three-dimensional nature of a city, you can't necessarily fire an artillery round because of the arc, right? There might be a building that's in the way, so you can't physically hit it because there's other things around it. So that's why when you're dropping a bomb from the air, you can put it where you want to put it. So that's where, whether those fires are coming from field artillery, helicopters, which had their own vulnerabilities, we saw in Somalia, but we've seen that throughout warfare. Or it's coming from an aircraft, that's 20, 30,000 feet up in the air, right? That's absolutely critical to support in the force.
So talk about sort of the way a plan for combat in a densely populated urban area evolves. How do you sit down? Who's involved? I mean, there are multi-force factors to take into account here. But what are the commanding officers thinking about? And what are their priorities as they think about the challenge?
The first thing they're thinking about is there any way we can avoid the city altogether? And typically that's what most militaries do. That's what most militaries train to do. And so most militaries around the world, including our own, are unprepared or severely underprepared to fight in an urban environment because they just don't want to, because they know how bad it is, which is great until you have to actually go in. So the next kind of phase is active planning for the operation. So a battle like Fallujah 2, when they went in the second time, and the first one was ended prematurely because of this political pressure, because of the perceived damage, perceived collateral damage forced the military to stop the operation in Fallujah, which allowed the enemy to kind of build it up. And so it's significant planning on how you're going to do this, because again, part of it is at the tactical level, they have to get ready, but figuring out how you're going to tackle this complex obstacle. So oftentimes, many weeks or months of planning, as we saw for both Ramadi and Fallujah in Iraq, to kind of set the stage to do this. Part of it is deception, deceive the enemy about where you're going to come from, so you have an easier time for your attack. But there's no necessarily single best way to do it. It depends on the city. It depends on the environment. You can do kind of this thunder run, just charge to the center of the city, and then hope, make the enemy almost come to you. Or you can kind of go block by block, clearing it. That's kind of what they did. The Philippine army did in Marawi. Or you could do like we did in Ramadi, more of a counterinsurgency environment, kind of that ink blot method, right? Establish a foothold, a combat outpost, as they call it, get that ground and clear it, and then kind of build security out from there. And so it really depends on the environment, the enemy. And so there's not necessarily a single best way to do it, but more of different ways based off of what the environment might be and what the enemy has.
So let's add tunnels into this factor, because it's obviously very relevant right now. But from the case studies and from other examples we've been reading about, this is not unique to Gaza, that tunnels as a source of defense for military force goes back a long way. I was reading in the book that Iwo Jima, this famous battle in the Pacific, the Marines faced Japanese troops that were underground, that had built very sophisticated tunnel structures as a means of defense so they could come out when it was safe for them or better for them. And so that was an incredibly costly battle for the Marines.
Yeah, and tunnels, right? I mean, one, you can kind of move on first command and control down there, but you can move down there, right, unobserved from the enemy, and you kind of might clear an area, and then the enemy with a tunnel that you're unaware of, right, they pop out behind you, and now so none of your lines are secure. But no military wants to go into a tunnel, right? The tunnel rats that the U.S. Army had during the Vietnam War or something. You're going to look for any other way to kind of eliminate that threat that's down in a tunnel as opposed to going down there. And one of the reasons is, right, you're extremely vulnerable. And some of the tunnels that they have in, Israel or other places, right? I mean, some are, kind of just dug with dirt, or others are like, you had a machine go down there and dig this tunnel. But you don't have to have somebody that really knows how to shoot. All they have to do is be hidden around a corner or point the weapon around, and the bullets are just going to kind of hug the wall, bounce off the wall, not like that, like a laser, but they're just going to go down and travel to into the tunnel. So you don't have to really be a great shot to inflict harm down on someone, that, especially if it's a long tunnel, as they're trying to go down and clear it. Not to mention, right, you have problems of breathing down there, depending on where it is, right? How do you breathe, especially if there's any kind of smoke or anything down there, or you have to do any kind of breaching. As we said before, right, communications don't work down there past line of sight. Your cell phone, your radios aren't going to work. Navigation becomes extremely complicated. Think of any time you pop out of a subway, especially people that don't know the city that well. Just imagine no signs up there and getting off. I guess it's pretty easy here because you have uptown and downtown. You know which way you're going, but right, other places you get out, you don't know which way is north, south, east, west. You totally lose all bearings down there. And so tunnels are extremely challenging. And then I've seen videos before the current conflict of when the Israelis had bombed some tunnels. You have no idea what it's going to do. So, right, they bomb a tunnel because they know it's there kind of underneath a road. And the next thing you know, a building that's 3 blocks away comes down because of the overpressure. That's where the tunnel came out. And you weren't trying to take down this building. It's collateral damage from knocking out the tunnel that you took down this 10-story apartment building that was connected to the tunnel.
So what are, have any effective means of dealing with tunnels? If you don't want to send your force down there, what are the most effective ways of dealing with tunnels when they're hiding an enemy or whatever else?
I mean, I think we don't have a lot of great measures. We don't have a lot, in the U.S., we don't do a lot of non-lethal measures because, riot control agents or something like that, those things can be pretty deadly when they're in a tunnel, right? You might think it's non-lethal, but it can become lethal just because of the concentration of it. But we typically don't even use those above ground because we're afraid it'll be viewed as a chemical weapon, which is kind of ironic. So soldiers are often left with no choice but to shoot someone as opposed to using a non-lethal mean because might be doing that, but right, you can use smoke to try to smoke them out. But again, the challenge is, right, that could be very lethal if you're not trying to be lethal, because smoke, right, it's just like being in a building in a fire, right? It's very lethal, right? We've seen, some forces kind of, use the flamethrowers and stuff. I've never seen anybody in the Army, there might be units that have it. I haven't seen it, so we've kind of shied away from that. You could try to flood the tunnel, but that's kind of like once you get to that point, that's how you do it. Otherwise, it's oftentimes really just kind of, just putting a charge down there and just destroying a portion of the tunnel. And so you're just kind of, just think of it, like a hall or whatever, just kind of destroying that. And then they're going to have to clear that rubble before they can use it. But that's typically the method, either kind of a bomb drop from the air that's going to penetrate the ground, right? Kind of a bunker buster. So they can go, it's not going to penetrate when it hits the surface, but it'll go down to where the tunnel is, penetrate, blow up down there. But you're not destroying the length of the tunnel, you're just destroying that portion, putting it out of service for several days or maybe weeks. But that's really the best method we have now. We're trying to flood them, but not a lot of great methods.
I think the Wall Street Journal has reported that the Israelis are starting an attempt to flood the tunnels, but is there a precedent for this? Do you know of whether it's worked elsewhere?
I haven't seen it. I mean, I know people were pitching that proposal right at the start of this conflict, realizing that was something they could do. But really, you got to find some way to fill it in. Is really what you're doing. You fill it with water. That's again temporary because depending on the construction of the tunnel, because then you can, once the water's drained at some point, the tunnel still exists.
Yeah. I'm going to turn now to an article from Foreign Affairs recently by Daphne Rishman Barak, who is based in Israeli University, but her field of study is tunnel warfare. And she's assessing the situation there. This was written about a month ago. And the headline of the article is, Israel must destroy Hamas's tunnels That, she says, is the most important thing that the Israelis need to accomplish from this, that Hamas leadership can be replaced, but the tunnel structures, as long as they're there, they're going to pose a threat that was manifested very clearly on October 7th and would come back by Hamas's own declaration. So she then talks about the difficulty of doing this because you don't want to send troops down there, and the bombs only blow up a part of it, but it's extraordinarily extensive based on whatever we know to this point. So how do you assess, these efforts to prepare the terrain? I mean, we're seeing incredible amounts of bombing in Gaza and an extraordinary range of tunnels underground. Put those two pieces together for us.
Yeah, I mean, it looks at like what's their stated goal, or what is their actual goal, and their stated goal is the destruction of Hamas, right? Which, as you kind of alluded to, I don't think that's possible, right? It's not a realistic goal, even if you eliminated all current Hamas members. If you don't address the underlying root problems of the conflict, they're going to reemerge in some form or another, a different name, whatever. And so it's really destroying, just really degrading the organization and degrading their capability, right? Even if you cleared, to some extent, even if you eliminate all the tunnels, they will build more. If you take away all the weapons, they will get more. But you want to degrade them to a level so they're not capable of conducting attack like they did on October 7th, and that's a realistic goal. And so you don't have to destroy every single tunnel. I mean, that's probably not, even if you destroy them, right, they're going to start rebuilding them. You definitely want to destroy any of them that are coming into Israel. They did that before when they kidnapped some Israeli soldiers years ago that started a previous incursion into Gaza. But without a doubt, that's a critical piece of what they have to do, because if a tunnel is run, and Hamas and you've seen other organizations do it too, but use the laws of warfare against their enemy, and we'll set up. As in my experience in Iraq, there wasn't I didn't go into a mosque unless I actually had a need to and had to. But I think every single mosque I went into was basically a storage place for arms and ammunition, right? So clearly the enemy is violating laws of warfare, right? So tunnels that are going under hospitals, schools, these kind of things that then the international, kind of a public opinion is going against the attacker when it's really the defenders the one that putting these people at risk, not the attacker, because they're building and, operating and using schools or hospitals or whatever to defend and putting their own citizens at risk. So, but yeah, tunnels, I mean, that they've got to eliminate what they can. But to try to do, I think it's unrealistic to do everything. It's kind of a point of diminishing returns, get to a point where they think it's good enough and the operation is culminated, and then kind of move on to the next phase of the operation.
As you look at, what's going on the ground there, to a layman's eye, it seems like a very daunting prospect in terms of the amount of underground mileage that they would have to deal with. Obviously, the civilians, the hostages of their own. One of the conclusions from one of the case studies is that urban warfare takes longer than anybody plans for. And so the clock is ticking in terms of international opinion, but the mission may not be accomplished within that time frame. So where do these pieces factor in, and how far can you get without having enough time to do all of this?
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, in Battle of Fallujah, the second Battle of Fallujah, that because of the first one, it was forced in prematurely. That was on everybody's mind. We have to be done with this in about 2 months, or that kind of clock is ticking. Others not so much for Ramadi, because again, that was kind of the counterinsurgency, go in there, kind of ink blot, methods, combat outpost. You might have a little more. You have more time to do that kind of thing. But yeah, without a doubt, when they went in, I mean, you knew it was going to ramp up. It took about 3 weeks before they sent the ground force in. And again, that took 3 weeks of planning. When you think about it, they really didn't have a war plan for this thing. They probably had something, but not even close to this. If you look at their previous incursions into Gaza, nothing on this magnitude, right? And so they had to build this plan from scratch while they're activating reservists to go in and do this. So, pretty daunting task. So where are we going? What was the question?
No. I'm following you through the tunnels here. You know, the time is a factor here.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
political.
and
right.
the international pressure is there.
Right.
But the commanders want to be able to accomplish the mission they've been given. So you get this political military conflict in some way.
Yeah, I mean, so I figured it about 2 months into the ground invasion, they would the pressure would ramp up on this, that they might be forced to stop. But I mean, the Israelis, they don't have a lot of friends in the region, and they don't have a lot of friends kind of in the international realm. So to some extent, I don't think they totally care what some of the pressure is, because they're looking at what is in their best interest, and they're trying to eliminate this threat so somebody doesn't come in and 1,200 of their citizens and take 150 people hostages ever again. And when you look at something like this, we suffered, the 9/11 attacks. We lost a lot more people, without a doubt, on 9/11. But we didn't have 150 people taken hostage, right? That is something that we've never seen done historically. But yeah, that's the politics plays from the onset, but it's really kind of the political military decision on what they're going to do, and it's always, and military operations are inherently political.
So, the question of proportionality has come up in relation particularly to the air campaign, which, as we said earlier, is generally an important part of such an operation and maybe the most effective means of achieving the goal of disabling as many tunnels as possible. But, you have experience in these kinds of situations where there are lawyers attached to the various elements that are moving. It's true in Israel, it's true in the American case. Take us inside that dynamic of, the legal opinion on the spot, on the scene, under specific circumstances. How does that work, and is it a genuine constraint on what commanders will do?
Yeah, I mean, back up a little bit, right? I mean, you think about, okay, first you got to have military necessity, which they clearly do, right? No one's, arguing that the Israelis don't have a right to go in there and prevent this type of attack in the future and eliminate the threat. Then there's distinction, right? Trying to distinguish civilians from non-civilians. And Israelis, right, they're trying to do that, right? That's why they were trying to evacuate everybody to the south, get out of the combat zone. It makes it easier to kind of distinguish, right, the combatant from the non-combatant. But the proportionality, right, that's kind of like what is too much. And without a doubt, on our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, those favored heavily into determining what somebody might use, right? So typically, and the Israelis are doing it all the time, they're using a lesser munition. They're putting their forces at risk where they otherwise would not want to, because they're trying to minimize that collateral damage, minimize that risk to civilians, as much as it may not look like from the outside to some. That factors in all the time. And so without a doubt, I mean, that's something they thought of from the onset, and that's something that they think of. And that's one of the real challenges in urban environment, because the population density is so much greater, right? The collateral damage is so much greater. And then the international, right, public opinion viewing this thing is so much greater than you get anywhere else. These all make it extremely challenging. But without a doubt, you consider that every time you go in, what you're going to do and what you're, right? The idea is to kind of, typically the U.S. rules of engagement, to kind of start small and work up or something.
When you think about, and you mentioned it before, the use of civilians as essentially human shields, because you're building a military infrastructure within and below a civilian society, that just seems an unsolvable problem. How can you get us inside that problem?
And the challenge with that, again, looking at this current conflict or other conflicts, it's almost always, the public opinion of people blaming the attacker because they dropped a bomb on a school or a religious site or something like that, when really the opinion should be on the person that's putting these people at risk, right? Putting their own people at risk, using them as human shields. We've seen it in Sri Lanka, with the Tamil Tigers. We've seen it, the Russians aren't afraid to set up, right, their artillery positions next to targets that would typically not. And so they take what would be non-lawful targets and then make them lawful targets. But believe me, no military wants to go into a school. They don't want to drop a bomb anywhere near a school. They don't want to do it near a hospital. But they're forced to, right, out of military necessity. They have a need to eliminate the target that's there. right? They're using what they have to do it. But I think until people try to start to shift the blame to the person that's putting these people at risk to begin with, I don't really see a great solution for it.
What, thinking about the dilemma they face, of course, and the time ticking away, but there is this sense that proportionality means that the number of civilian casualties should not surpass a certain amount. Can you take us into your own experience of the various weights that are given to protecting civilians as against protecting the military force you're sending into an urban area? I mean, the priority has got to be, first off, defending your country, which I think everybody agrees Israel had a just reason to go to war. And then the proportionality conversation begins. But it's not just your country you're trying to protect. You're also trying to do what you can to protect the ground troops and others who are moving into these environments. Have you had experiences where you really had that very, very difficult balancing act to do?
Yeah, I mean, I was usually, doing kind of pinpoint raids, but the decision we made even at a smaller level, right? Can I go in here surreptitiously and get the target that I need rather than dropping a bomb and kind of cleaning up after, right? So for me, I've always, let me go with the lower threat, maybe assume more risk in the short term, but allows me to get there without kind of the repercussions on the other end. But on proportionality, right, I think, people that are saying war crimes, this and that, a lot of times they just don't know what they're talking about, right? There is no set magic number that says, hey, if you kill 10 civilians for every one fighter that you kill, that's proportionality is too far on the extreme or something. It's a tough choice. There is no black and white on these kind of things. It's more of a delicate balancing act, as you describe on that. But yeah, it would, General Petraeus or General McChrystal, when they were commanding force in Afghanistan or Iraq, there was that decision every time when they went in to go do a raid, or if they were using a predator or a drone to hit a target, right? There was an evaluation, especially like in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. Okay, we're pretty confident on the intelligence. We know, right, this senior Al-Qaeda leader is there, but he's got so many family members with him, right? What are we willing to kind of proportion, or in that case, proportionality? You can measure a little bit more. You can identify them, right? They're not in an urban area where you don't really know what's there. And the decisions were made. Oftentimes, nope, we cannot drop the bomb here. Let's wait till the target moves out, even if it means we lose them. And so that decision was being made all the time. Again, a little easier in that kind of environment. Versus Israel, and again, like something that we've never had to face, at least in a long time, right? The Israelis that are in there, right? They've got Hamas that's firing rockets over their heads onto their homes, right? And so we're typically in an expeditionary conflict, right? This is in their, backyard.
Let me ask, one of the things that came up through comments by some of the folks in your book, we're just turning now to the Russians and their experience in dealing with underground fighting, and the thought that this may be something, their expertise in urban warfare is being demonstrated to whatever degree it is in Ukraine. And so this idea that the military can avoid or wants to avoid urban combat, it seems less and less likely that militaries will avoid urban combat.
Yeah, if you look, I challenge most people to, when they say, hey, we're going to avoid urban areas, wars aren't going to be fought there, and look at the mega trends of urbanization, right, and population growth. If you look at 1960, we had 3 billion people on Earth. 2000, we have 6 billion, and in 2035, we'll have 9 billion, right? So it took the entire history of the Earth to get 3 billion, and 40 years later, we doubled that. And right, as more and more people get to be urban, right, 35% in 1960, and it's, over 50% in 2009, right? So by 2035, we'll have 6 billion people living in cities, right? And war is fought where people are. And so you can't avoid the cities. And the other part of it is, right, those are political centers, right? They become even if they don't have tactical value of their own, like Bakhmut, right? You heard about Bakhmut for months, right? Russia threw everything they had at Bakhmut, and it took them 10 months to take this tactically insignificant city, because then it became important just because it took on a life of its own. But oftentimes, right, in their key objective at the start of the conflict was to go into downtown Kyiv, the head of government, and force the Zelensky regime to capitulate it, right? So these are heads of government as well. So they have all this significant value, so you can't avoid them. You get pulled into them, no matter how much you try to avoid it.
I just, we'll take a couple of questions in a moment, but trying to come to some summary in relation to what's going on in Gaza, it doesn't seem from what you're saying like, in spite of whatever Israel is doing, in spite of whatever Hamas is doing to hit back, do you think there's going to be a conclusive outcome to this?
I mean, Hamas will be severely. It really depends on what Israel, what they look at, kind of the post-conflict phase going to be. They left Gaza because it was too hard to actively occupy it and provide that security force, because then they're at risk every day. But they would like to have a UN force or something do that, so they don't have to absorb that risk. But I don't think the UN or anybody else wants to take on that risk. So maybe it's kind of increasing that buffer zone, but it's kind of what is really the political end state of that. I've seen Israel had some kind of pre-invasion ideas floated around, and one of them was to just move everybody out of Gaza into the Sinai. Well, no one's going to go for that, but that was something they were recommending doing, right? It eliminates the threat for Israel, but it's just not realistic, right? The international community is not going to allow that to happen. And so I think it's partly what are they willing to allow, and what will political pressure allow it to do? Hard to figure out what it'll be. I mean, Hamas will be severely degraded. The idea won't be destroyed, even if they are. I don't think the population's really happy with Hamas putting them at risk like they did and have done throughout the conflict. But if you look at the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, they don't have the ability to govern it, and they're not popular with the Gazan citizens. And so it's not necessarily creating a whole new governance structure, but trying to figure out what they have there and figuring out both the governance and security piece. And I think that's what Israel is trying to figure out.
How do you assess the deterrence factor in terms of what Israel's doing? I mean, the surprise of October 7th and the scale of the losses was really unprecedented. There was this immediate recognition that they didn't seem capable of deterring even a smaller force. On the northern border, they have a much more potent enemy. And in making warnings to Lebanon, Israeli leaders are saying, look what we're doing in Gaza, this is going to happen to you if you start. Is that a factor? And how do you put that into the morality proportionality debate?
Yeah, I mean, lawyers and everybody else aren't going to look at that in terms of the morality and proportionality debate. They just won't. But without a doubt, how Israel responds, just like how the West responds with Russia's invasion into Ukraine. If the West hadn't supported Ukraine, then you're pretty much saying this is acceptable. And you guarantee that China would probably have been in Taiwan within a year or two if the international community did nothing. And so, right, part of it is, okay, what's the immediate thing, but a future deterrence, right? Deter Lebanese Hezbollah from doing anything in the north. And I think you've seen Hezbollah has stayed out of this. So I think it has had some deterrent effect. Maybe at the individual or lower level, some kind of ramp up of, kind of violence in those areas in the north and other places. But by and large, they've stayed on the sideline. And that was one of the big questions at kind of the onset of this is, what is Hezbollah going to do? And so I think it has had a deterrent effect that they don't want to have. They can see what the destruction is and see what the response will be. And so without a doubt, in terms of, part of it is eliminated, but part of it can be a punishment strategy of, right, punishing Gaza or punishing Hamas to say this is what will happen in the future for anybody else that does this kind of thing. So without a doubt, those are discussed at the military level and political level, and then the lawyers can weigh in and give their thoughts on how this will be viewed.
Let's see if we have a question or two. In the back, right there, Tom.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things we only talked about briefly, the hostages. and I believe several of them are Americans, which is not talked too much about. Where you think they are? I don't even know if they're still alive. Have they been smuggled to Iran or other enemy places? I mean, what is your intel? What are your thoughts on this? It's tragic, and we pray for them. But
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, they're all in Gaza, right? To try to get someone out of there, right? As soon as this happened, they closed it off, right, by the sea and the land, right? They know where kind of these smuggling routes are and stuff, but I mean, it's closed off. They're there. Probably a lot of them in tunnels, right? They're putting them down there. I mean, I'm surprised that they haven't kind of used the hostages more as a human shield again, because they don't really care. It doesn't appear that they've done that really to a large extent. But yeah, I mean, that's what makes this so much different than any other conflict is you have these hostages. And right, to try to go do a hostage rescue mission is extremely challenging. First, you have to have the intelligence of where they're at, right? That's the hardest part. Then even if you have that, now you have to figure out how to go and recover them, physically get from one place to another, right? If they're in a tunnel, how do you get down into the tunnel, recover them without getting them killed from their captor or a significant number of your force killed, and then evacuate out of there. And that's why somewhere like here, right, hostage rescue missions are going to be extremely, extremely unlikely because they're just so darn difficult to do. You got to have the intelligence and the capability to get in and out, right? The Israelis have a hostage recovery force, right? We have hostage recovery forces. That piece of it's easy. It's trying to the intelligence and getting to and from the target that's the hard part. Because how do you get there undetected so they don't move or kill the hostage that you have? And so that's why you saw the efforts to get them out of there diplomatically, which obviously, given the fact that none or maybe two were released in the first 3 weeks, shows you that there was not a real, effort by Hamas to want to give up these hostages because that may be the only leverage they have.
See you again. Over there, please.
I was just wondering, when the Israeli Air Force bombs an area with the intent of hitting and destroying the tunnel network, how do they know with certainty who they've hit? Because one example, the first time they bombed one of the refugee camps, within a couple hours, they came out and said with certainty by name, the commander that they killed, along with I think a certain number of other Hamas members. So I just wonder, how can they see exactly in the tunnel at that given moment who's there?
They're usually not doing that through visual observation, right? They can't look into a tunnel and see who's down there unless they actually have cameras down there they can penetrate, right, and do that. I mean, typically that's going to be through some other source of intelligence, right? Signal intelligence, human intelligence. It's telling them that's here, and then you're kind of relying on that to right, and you're not always certain. Sometimes the certainty can be very high, 99%. Think of like a bin Laden raid or something. That certainty was probably lower, right? There was probably maybe 30%, right? Hey, 30% chance he's here based on the intelligence that we have. But again, typically that's going to be in a tunnel or somewhere like that. A lot of that's going to be coming from signal intelligence, human intelligence. And then after the fact, right, how do you do the battle damage assessment, right? Okay, once the troops get on the ground, you can figure it out. But when it's just the air war going on, you can get that through, again, those same intelligence means, because whether you have it penetrated through human or through signals, right, they will say who is dead amongst themselves, right? They'll be like, so-and-so was killed last night. And so you're getting that through those means. That's how you're getting that.
In a tunnel, though?
I don't know if it's in a tunnel or something, but in urban environments, it's going to be the same thing, right? Except for, you're even though oftentimes you can't physically see them, you have that intelligence that will tell you where someone's at.
One more there, please.
Hello. Sorry, I'm a little sick, so my throat's a bit scratchy, but I have a two-part question. The first one is, who is going to rebuild Gaza after all of this? Because there are now almost 2 million homeless people who do not have many job prospects. Second question is, how is this different from the U.S. war on terror, which I feel like is regarded as a failure because it gave birth to more terrorism? But I'm curious to hear your take on that, how this approach of using force is different from that approach that we've already seen fail before.
I'll go to the second part. I mean, it's completely different scenario, right? Ours is terrorist organizations kind of away from the U.S., right? We're going there trying to fight expeditionary in other nations, kind of using their, Iraq and Afghanistan are a little different. We own that for a while, but it's going to be a much longer discussion. We could do a whole lecture on that, on Afghanistan, Iraq, or our failures. But I think Israel, right, if you look historically, they have been pretty effective with the punishment strategy. It has, again, not eliminated it, right? They seem to be pretty happy. There doesn't seem to be a real desire from Israel to have a two-state solution. If they thought that was their best outcome, they would have that already, right? And so I think they're happy with the strategy that they've had to date. And so it has worked historically, right? You look at suicide bombings, used to be a significant problem in Israel, right? Putting up a wall worked, right? The wall and the dome were great anti-terrorism measures. They were terrible defensive measures against as they saw on October 7th. They got too reliant on these things being effective anti-terrorism measures, but not good defensive measures, right? Walls can be breached, right? An iron dome can be penetrated when you put 1,000 things up in the air at one time. It was never meant to defeat those kind of numbers, right? But when you're shooting 20 or 30 in a day, not a problem, right? It's going to take out most of those or all of them that are going to hit populated areas. And so I would say, no, they've been fairly effective in the past, so there's no reason to believe that it won't be fairly effective in terms of a deterrent. In terms of building up Gaza, right, that's going to be the international community. You're talking about, one of the lowest GDP per capita on earth. That's what you have in Gaza. And so they can't rebuild that themselves. That's going to come from the international community.
Thank you. Colonel Collins actually has a plane to catch. So he actually fit us into his schedule for this evening. And so we're going to have to stop here. But I think we'll all agree that it was really very worthwhile that he made this time for us. So please join me in thanking Liam Collins.